Hi, everyone. This is Jen Blusky again. We're here today to talk about self-regulation. So self-regulation is something that's thrown around a lot for our kids and the ability to behave well in society. So what is self-regulation? Self-regulation is our ability to regulate our behavior and our reactions to our environment based on the feedback that we're getting from our world. So it's the ability to shift and change our behavior to make it more functional for the environment or the relationships that we're in the moment. So something we like to think about when we're talking about how do we help kids learn how to self-regulate. The first thing I like to talk about is how does regulation develop in infancy and in children? The reason this is so important is because we need to be able to go through each one of these developmental steps in order to become competent at the ability to self-regulate. So I'm just going to go through some of the steps in development that children go through as they learn. So we all know as newborns, our human newborns are very, very reliant on their caregivers. What we think about for self-regulation in our newborns is really it's guided regulation. The caregivers mediate just about everything in the context of regulation. Our newborns are regulating their body temperature some. They're able to have a reaction when they're hungry. But other than that, they're really reliant on their caregivers to regulate anything that's happening in their environment. There's some neurophysiological responses that newborns have to help them regulate, and these are typically reflexive in nature. These are reflexive body movements in order to regulate their environment. As babies move up into infants, around 3 to 4 months of age, we know that babies get some more control over motor skills. And infants and babies use these motor skills as the very, very beginnings of self-regulation. They might shake their hands when they're excited to let out some energy. They might curl up in a ball when they're nervous. So infants just start to get some movement patterns in place. They're just beginning to approach their caregivers to be regulated, right? So this is where our infants, 4, 5, 6 months, are just starting to reach out to caregivers to be picked up. They're starting to go towards their caregivers. Now, note that this is when the early patterns are set for caregivers responding to infants' needs, right? So when the self-regulation develops, it develops in the context of the caregiver relationship. The ability to regulate is taught by the caregivers being responsive to a child's needs. So as you can think about, if this doesn't go well, if we don't have a attuned or responsive caregiver, it's really difficult and I would say nearly impossible to develop competent self-regulatory skills. As kids move up into a young toddler age, the ages between 1 and 3, is when self-regulation really starts to be learned. Now, at this age, kids, right, have coordinated movements. They're able to move through space to regulate themselves. They're able to move away from something that they don't want. They're able to move towards something that they do want. This is when babies, right, they might be able to crawl across the room to pick up their pacifier to put it in their mouth. They may be able to crawl back to a caregiver when they didn't like something that happened in the playroom. They might be able to stop a movement to keep them safe. This is the beginnings of inhibiting movements in order to regulate behavior. They're starting to respond to caregivers' requests. Caregivers' requests such as, that's hot, don't touch. There's starting to be some inhibitory movements. So this developmental phase with regulation is incredibly powerful as children from the ages of about 1 and 3 are really exploring their environment and learning how to start and stop actions in order to regulate within the environment that they need to be in. Then we move into toddlerhood and young childhood, the ages 3 to 5. At this age, developmentally, children are finally able to have a concept of what it means to behave in the way that you're asked to in any given environment, which is regulation. They're starting to internally monitor, should I be doing this or should I not? Should I be I need to be sitting at circle time, and at the playground, I can be up and running around. Should I be using my inside voice or my outside voice? Should I be using gentle touch or more intense input? These are things that don't come online until kids are between 3 and 5. So that internal ability to monitor. And this requires the earlier developmental phases of exploring through space and exploring with coordinated movements. So this goes without saying, but if a child, for whatever reason, wasn't able to have or wasn't given those early developmental exploratory phases of regulation, that internal monitoring isn't going to come. So if we take this, if you're thinking about a child who's had a trauma history or an abuse or neglect history, where they didn't have the ability to move with self-volition or to act with self-volition, that internal monitoring doesn't necessarily turn on in the way that we would expect. Then, as children move from about the age of 5 to 7, cognitive flexibility and working memory really start kicking in. What we say in the field is that children are not able to independently self-regulate. That means independently assess the environment and regulate their state or their alertness to their environment based on what's expected. They're not able to do this until about the developmental age of 7. So this is something that's important to remember. Not the chronological age of 7, but the developmental age of 7. Before this, children acquire the support of a caregiver or a trusted adult in order to regulate. And so something we think about in treatment, and something we think about when we're working with parents, is what supports do your children still need based on their self-regulation maturity in order to learn how to regulate. Sometimes asking them to do it themselves is something that they don't have in place as of yet. I wanted to share a quick screen capture with you that talks about why we care about regulation. So, regulation is the ability to have the arousal state that is a good match for our environment. This window of tolerance was developed by Dan Siegel, and it speaks to how we move through different states throughout our day. If you want to look at the center box, what you see is that our sweet spot of learning is called our window of tolerance. This is where we are able to learn, where we're able to love, where we're able to relax, where we're able to engage. Later, if you watch our next video on trauma, we'll talk a little bit more about this window of tolerance and how we move through it. But for now, what our job is to regulate such that for most of our time, we're able to stay in this state that keeps us safe and that keeps us learning and engaging in our world. Sometimes when there's trauma or when there's difficult circumstances in our environment, and we know that there's difficult circumstances that pop up all the time, our bodies are trained, our bodies are set up to move into 2 different areas. One is hyperarousal. And so that's the person on the left with the raised fists in the red. This is our sympathetic nervous system. This is our fight-flight state. This is when we need to be alerted because there's possible danger, right? So we're going to fight, we're going to run, we're going to hit, we're going to scream, we're going to avoid, our heart rate's going to go up. We're going to be at high alert because we need to protect ourselves. So there are appropriate times to do this. If we are in danger of being hurt by another person, it is important and imperative to move into a fight-flight state. If somebody took a toy from you, it's probably not important to be in a fight-flight state. That would be something that we would want to help kids learn how to regulate through so that they can stay in that window of tolerance, so that they can use all of their adaptive strategies to work through that problem. The other state that we think about that is outside our window of tolerance is our hypoarousal state. So this is our dorsal vagal. This is when things just become too much and we can't anymore. This is when our system just shuts down. We numb out. We feel dead inside. We zone out. We might have tummy aches. We might be hypervigilant to our environment, but not be able to act on it. So this is what happens when we don't feel confident, our bodies, our nervous system doesn't feel confident that it can act and keep us safe. So we go into ourselves. If you think about our world these days, a lot of our people in our world, and some of the time, are hanging out in this hypoaroused state, right? We're on our phones, we're shut down, or blocking the world. That sometimes can feel too much. Our job as caregivers, as therapists, is to help our children and our clients move into this window of tolerance so that we can act on our world, that we can act in an appropriate way. I wanted to give you one other slide that talks about what happens when our window of tolerance hasn't worked for us in the way that we hope. So we haven't yet spoken about trauma. Another video will talk about trauma, but chronic dysregulation is something that we see with some of our kids and some of our adults. We see this for a number of different reasons. One is a trauma history. One is a neurological set point of a sensory system that isn't working well, and a number of other reasons. What we like to see with, as we talked about in the window of tolerance, we want our ability to stay in the window of tolerance to be pretty wide. So a lot of different events and inputs, expectations can happen. And we're able to stay in this place of engaging, relating, communicating, problem solving. Right? That is what keeps us in the most functional place in our world. If you have chronic dysregulation, your window of tolerance shrinks. You haven't been taught how to stay in that window of tolerance, right? When we talk about self-regulation and the development of self-regulation, our job as caregivers is to help children learn how to stay in a place where they can problem solve through the world, where the world isn't threatening. They can move through the environment and keep their arousal state at such where they can actively engage with them. If for whatever reason this isn't taught, or this isn't learned, or this doesn't inherently become part of your being, your window of tolerance shrinks such that things need to be pretty in line to be able to problem solve, relate, use language. If something becomes too stressful, your body then very quickly moves into that hyperaroused or hypoaroused state. So what we see with our kids with chronic dysregulation is they tend to spend quite a bit of their time in that hypo or hypoaroused state, and that ability to pass through that window of tolerance is very small. The way we change this therapeutically and relationally is supporting through the relationship and all of the things we'll talk about in our strategies talks to widen that window of tolerance. So within our world of regulation, the important things to know is that our regulation is guided by our sensory experiences. Our regulation is learned and developed through our caregiver relationships. And we can change our ability to regulate through input through our relationships and through our sensory systems. Thanks so much for paying attention today to my talk, and I'm excited to tell you more in the future. Thanks so much.